But if you have conviction around something you want to pursue, and people are telling you their truth, like, hey, this is not a good idea, sometimes you have to filter that out. And you have to make the decision ultimately at the end of the day around what's right for you. And if anything else, we, I think, have elevated the space to want more for no-code. Like even Bubble, like they're making changes now to rise up to the capabilities that Xano has, right? When I was at Google, I was working on the product design side of things. I've always liked The Matrix. I remember seeing that movie the first time it came out. I left the theater and I walked back in, and I did that like twice. Is this reality? Is there something more, right? So I think the future of no-code is that.
All right, so today I have Prakash on the podcast. Prakash is the co-founder of Xano, one of the leading no-code tools for running the backend. Prakash also in his spare time hosts a podcast for Radio MD. So welcome to the podcast, Prakash.
Josh, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Looking forward to going into your story a lot and diving into the world of no-code and diving into all the lessons you've learned along the way. But I'd love to kick things off right back at the beginning. What's your journey been like from the beginning? What was life like growing up in Malibu as a child?
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, I think like the entrepreneurial gene or spirit, really, I think I give a lot of credit to my father for. You know, he kind of came to this country with nothing as a Sri Lankan immigrant. He went to UCLA for graduate school, the good old $5 in your pocket or to your name. And basically from that time, he was able to kind of build his wealth and got us to a place where we were living in Malibu when I was very young, you know, like coming from nothing. So that's like basically a primer for, I think, where I get my entrepreneurial drive. So growing up in Malibu, you know, we still were kind of instilled with all of the principles of hard work and, you know, being an Asian kid because my mom is Chinese. You know, I was forced to study a lot and to learn an instrument. In my case, it was piano. And then, yeah, went to school in Malibu, and I was actually really one of the only Asian kids in that school. And then after that, I went off to college at Cal Poly Pomona, also in the LA area. And then, yeah, just kind of grew my career from there. So I could kind of keep unraveling the story, but starting with the Malibu primer, and I think the foundation my parents set for me, I think is an important piece that I look back on and I'm very appreciative of.
Really? So you said your parents kind of instilled this entrepreneurial spirit in you. That was always there even as when you were a kid?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think like they very much made it clear. Like I think it would be hard, like growing up in Malibu, you just assume like this is the way that life is, just because it's kind of an idyllic place, like you see it on TV, the movie stars live there, etc. But I think I very much knew, and actually when I was very young, we moved from like downtown LA area to Malibu, and I saw the work that went into making that happen. And my dad really stretched kind of beyond his means to make it happen because he wanted a very like good and safe lifestyle for us, his children, for me and my sister. And so that there was that piece of it. And I think always him reminding us and my mom reminding us of where we've come from and to be appreciative of everything is that piece of like saying, oh, okay, if I want something like this for myself, I have to work really hard for it.
Okay. That's really interesting. I imagine those are characteristics that would have carried with you all throughout life. Yeah, so what happened after university? You went on to Google or you went on to another business to start up?
Yeah, so I think like at the time that I was like in high school and going into college, the internet was just forming. And so, you know, I was very much a child of the creation of the internet where you're building your own PCs, you're playing like games on floppy disks and things of that nature. And in this creation of the internet age, like when websites were being just invented, like on GeoCities and things of that nature, me and one of my good friends, who's now my co-founder, after we met, we basically started a web design business that gave us a lot of the tools that we needed to set the foundation for our career in technology. And so going to school, I started in computer science, and I realized very quickly my brain didn't work that way. And then I moved to like more of a business degree because I knew that in my side gig of like creating websites, I was learning all that stuff so that the business would help me. And then after school, I had a couple different job opportunities, but luckily I was able to go into this small company called Picasa, which was a photo organization tool. I don't know if you remember it. It actually became Google Photos, and Google actually ended up buying that company. So I got the side door into Google.
Well played. So you decided to switch from a computer science degree to a business degree, and now you're running Xano, which is obviously a massive company, which is a lot of computer science knowledge would have been required for that. Was it just because you were doing the side gig of learning a lot of that computer science? Is that really like why you switched over to the business degree, or was it just like your brain didn't work that way, or what was that for? Yeah.
Yeah, I would never I think like computer science, like at its core, when they teach you things about, how the computer works, the compiler, at least the time that I was going, the first classes that you're taking are like C, C++, which is a lot more low level languages. And I don't know, it never really, was sticky to me. Like, I think I was more of a product oriented person, a design-oriented person, which is why I switched from computer science into more of the business degree. I think later on in life, through my experience at Google, doing my own startup, you realize that, okay, well, in order to actually build the things that I want, I have to learn about this software. So when you have that pull and that desire, it's much easier to then say, okay, well, I think this thing is worth learning versus this is just a class that I need to take to get a passing grade to go on and get my degree, right? There's two different, I think, pulls there. So I think I was just more mature later on in life to give me the foundation that I then needed to start Xano.
Wow. Yeah, I can imagine that would have been very handy when starting Xano. So what was the drive for, because I guess you were at Google for 8 years. Yeah, what was the drive to kind of move on to something more entrepreneurial? You said earlier you had this entrepreneurial spirit growing up from your family, and then you're at Google for 8 years, and then you kind of moved on to pursue some entrepreneurial ventures. Where did that drive come from? Was it just a reignition of that drive, or?
Yeah, I think I should also mention and add to my childhood that my dad, outside of he was a buyer for precious jewels for a company called Bullocks Wilshire I Bagnon. So he did that as his day job, but on the side he was doing real estate. And for my mom, she actually started a little crystal shop on the side, and she grew that. So I kind of watched them create things for themselves rather than working for someone else, right? So I think that's another piece outside of what I mentioned already. And I think when working at Google, I was incredibly blessed to be there at the time that I was. I really learned everything. It set up a really strong foundation for myself. But in many ways, I really felt Google was just such a big organization, and it was growing. And my contribution to that success was, it's not that I didn't do anything. It's just that I never really felt like it was my own, right? And so at some point I was I need to do something for myself. And after 8.5 years, when I'd kind of risen the ranks, I really had to I came to this decision of okay, well, do I want to go into executive territory and continue to further Google's mission, or do I want to, kind of split off and do my own thing? And I chose the latter.
That's a really big decision to do. Were you ever afraid or nervous about doing that? I know in the past when I've had to move on from jobs, there's a little bit of fear there, but were you ever afraid, or it didn't bother you at all?
Of course. Yeah. I mean, it's the unknown. And I think I had been thinking about it for 4 years before I actually pulled the trigger. And then even when I did, everyone thought my parents thought it was a bad decision. My friends thought it was a bad decision. Like everyone in my life basically was like, you're with like the most popular tech company in the world. It's like you're doing really well. You're making really good money. Why would you ever leave something like that? So it's kind of one of these things where it was like the first really big confidence step I had to take in my life because, you always, I think first and foremost, you kind of try to look for the people you respect, you look for their approval, right? And oftentimes that's your family and your friends. And so when that's not there, it forces you to kind of build this conviction into stepping into the unknown. But for whatever reason, I felt like it was the right thing for me to do. And, I think I kind of grew enough courage to take that step eventually. And obviously it's been the best decision ever, but it was very unclear at the time.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you say that you kind of knew it was the right decision. A lot of the listeners, are aged, between 20 and 30 years old. A lot of them are making bigger decisions in life. What do you think are some of the, I guess, like signs that they're making the right decision or that they need to move on? Is there any kind of signs or signals that you think kind of indicate when you need to move on, or is that just kind of you follow your gut kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to codify looking backwards, but I would say I think one piece of it is the gut, right? Like we always say, well, follow your instincts, follow your gut. Well, what does that really mean? Your gut tells you lots of different things. I would say first and foremost, I think that especially in that demographic between your 20s and 30s, what you're kind of trying to do is find out what is your superpower, right? What gives you joy? What do you want to spend more time doing, right? And for a lot of people, that answer is actually not that clear. You're well, I could do a lot of different things, right? So I think it's kind of important to build in the reps to try a lot of different things so you can at least narrow in the things you don't like, right? So I would say you should spend time at companies if don't have analysis paralysis and do nothing for fear of making the wrong decision. I would just make a decision, try to work at a place, learn as much as you can, because there's obviously what you're really good at and what you're meant to do, but there's all these ancillary abilities around how you get along with people, politicking, presenting. All those are generic, and you put in the reps there while you narrow in as to what you were meant to do. So I would say moving back, I try to put myself in my 20-year-old self's brain. I feel like that was something that I wish I had a little bit more narrow instruction on. Just put in the reps and try to find what brings you joy and where you want to kind of be growing in.
Okay. Was it an easy process for you, finding what brings you joy, or was it quite a long journey to find that?
It's quite a long journey, but I think it starts with you'll generally get a sense of I like doing X activity over Y, and that can be something within a business, that can be something within your life, and it's really just taking the time to sit still and ask yourself why you feel like you like that. And they have this root cause, 3 whys. I'm sure you've heard of this before, where you ask yourself why, and then you ask yourself why again and again. And then at some point, when you really, really narrow in, you'll kind of get to the root cause of why that is a primary driver for you. So for example, at a big company, I'll just keep it super simple. Is my time, for me personally, best spent trying to figure out the code base, right? Computer science, problem solving, logic, etc. For whatever reason, when I spend time there, I feel like it's hard. And there's sometimes you want to subscribe to hard, but not to you should feel compelled to want to get better at the thing. And I have no desire to get better at that one thing because it feels for example, for me, the operational or the user experience or the product oriented thing is the thing I'm actually more excited about. So it really starts with a feeling and then interrogating that feeling further and further and just spending more time or crafting your life in such a way where you spend more time doing that stuff.
Okay. So there's a lot of trial and error and figuring it out and digging a lot deeper with those whys. I really like that. That's a really good way of putting it.
Yeah, I think the biggest piece of feedback is that like things that matter take a long time to get right. And sometimes that's like you figuring out what your superpower is or where you want to spend time. Sometimes that's building a business. You have to really have an understanding from early on that it's just going to take consistency over time. And I think that's the biggest thing because we kind of, I mean, this is talked about, but we all want to find that silver bullet answer. And I think the older I get, the more I realize there really is none. It's just like consistency, putting in the reps, day after day after day after day. And then eventually, if it's intentional where you direct your reps, you'll figure out like the right path to take.
If the reps are intentional, you'll figure out the right path to take. Okay. That's really interesting. I've heard you say that quote before, things that matter take time. I heard you say that on a few podcasts. I think that's like a really interesting idea. I really like that one.
Yeah. I mean, I think that just the takeaway is like when we're young, we're so anxious. We're so anxious to get there, wherever there is, right? And to figure it out. And I think that's good. It like motivates us to kind of like maybe try a lot of things, but like you just got to realize that like sometimes you're subscribing for something that's going to just take a while, and you have to be okay with that, which is why like I'm such a firm believer in trying to like align yourself and where you spend the time, where you put in the reps with an area that you actually enjoy, right? So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. So I guess fast forward, you moved on from Google and you started Zabernet, and then you started Xano. So I'd love to get into a bit of the story of Xano and where did the idea come from for you and your co-founders to start Xano?
Yes. So, when I was at Google, I was working on the product design side of things. And then my co-founder, and who happens also to be my best friend from like when I was 12, he was working on the technology side of things. And so when we left kind of around the same time. I took this entrepreneurial path, like doing startups, and he took the agency path, building software for other people. And he did that with our third co-founder, Jack. So basically, my path was starting Zabernet, which was my first startup, which I like on every podcast that I'm on, I always call it like 3.5 to 4 years of me getting the crap kicked out of myself, just learning all of the things not to do. And I think, but that's great. Like I needed to go through that, right? Because you build conviction around like some of the opinions that you form. So I did that. And once that kind of once that failed, I basically went into consulting, as one does after a failed startup. And then really, I think that was a really formidable experience because I learned a lot about what I was good at, how to sell myself individually based on the experiences that I had. And one of the things as I was consulting and keeping track of Sean, right, I always knew that even for myself and other companies, all of the spend or most of the spend in a software company goes to making the software itself, right? And for me, I remember when I was building the software, I wasn't a coder. I obviously knew the principles, but I just poured money into my engineering team and I had no oversight or insight. And I was like, God, there's got to be a better way than this. And then watching my buddy, he created Xano actually as an internal tool at the agency so they could take on more customers without growing the team. After like a decade of this, so I was doing a startup and then consulting, and then he was just doing the agency and internal Xano at the same time. I saw that he had this thing, even though it was a command line tool, that could build the hardest part of software, which is the backend, in like minutes, like just spin it up. And I was like, this is crazy. Like if I had this when I was doing my startup, or if some of these other companies had it, like they wouldn't have to suffer through the same pains that I did. And so I'm like, if we productize this and brought it to the market, I think we could have something special, something different than like, the Airtables and the Zapier out there, but like creating real software without limits. And so that's kind of the origin story of Xano and why we decided to come together and do that.
That's very cool. What was the process like of taking it from an internal tool to now like an external facing tool that you're selling to users? Was that a really difficult process to do that, or was it most of the architecture really already there?
No, it was, I mean, I would say that we were opinionated on how we wanted to architect it, but basically starting in the beginning of 2018, like late 2017, early 2018, is when we like decided to take that and re-engineer it from the ground up to be a product that we could put on the market. And I think there were a couple challenges. By the way, none of us took a salary. We all kept our consulting gigs. This was very much a side bet. And so we were like, okay, well, there's a couple things that we're going to do that are non-consensus and non-obvious. The first is that we're going to architect it in this like single tenant way where everyone gets their own resources, and we're going to focus on scalability and security, which at like now it makes sense. But at the time it was like, it wasn't as important, like maybe for really, really big enterprise customers, but not like anyone smaller. I think the second thing we did was a lot of people were telling us that we should use terminology like workflows, scenarios, zaps, just like, you know, all the other no-code tools we're doing. And we're like, look, we believe that people should understand the language of software around APIs, databases, and it's our responsibility to teach them. So we're going to keep the language steeped in software engineering principles and do it that way. So I think there were those two things were against us because people were like, that's not a good idea. So from 2018 to basically late 2020, we spent working part-time engineering Xano, right? Making it something that the public could consume in our spare time while we were working our jobs. And still at that point, you just don't know, like, are people going to like it? And then when we launched in January of 21, you kind of see this trickle effect, and then it just starts building and building and building, all the while we're listening to feedback and starting to grow it. And it really wasn't until 2022 that we realized like we had something special, and that's when we, you know, decided to raise money against it. But you can see like what that timeline, like late 2017, early 2018, building in this like world where we're not sure if it's going to be successful in our part-time, right? Like, so we have to do our day jobs and then work on it part-time, and then eventually launching. I mean, that span just right there, that's 4 years, right? It takes a while.
Yeah, I can imagine that would have been a lot of hard work and a lot of years, but it's kind of cool to see the effect of it now. Even now, I do a lot of work in Bubble, and I've noticed a couple of years ago, most people would build in Bubble and then they'd get to a point and then be like, okay, now I want to switch to something more scalable. But from what I've seen now is a lot of people are saying as soon as they start a project, hey, we want to build our backend in Bubble, our backend in Xano and our front end in Bubble. And they're wanting that straight from the get-go. So I think it's like a really cool testament to how far you guys have come, that's like people are wanting that straight up.
Yeah, I think it's awesome to see. And I've said this before, like we wouldn't be here without Bubble. Bubble has like forged a way to make software creation more accessible. And if anything else, we, I think, have elevated the space to think more, to want more for no code. Like even Bubble, like they're making changes now to rise up to the capabilities that Xano has, right? Which I think is ultimately a good thing because the consumer wins at the end of the day. So, I think it is wonderful to see the change that we've been able to contribute to the no-code space, just as they have contributed the ability to build software without code. So, I think our posture has always been, this is like Xano as a backend, we are a front-end agnostic tool. We believe we want to work with a lot of different players. We want to be the best on the market, absolutely, but we think that we have a lot to share with the other players in the community, just as we have enjoyed the benefits that they have like kind of, or the path that they have forged before us.
Yeah, I think that's really cool that you can kind of link up any front end to Xano. Which front ends are you kind of seeing are the most popular? Like, is it Webflow or Bubble, like Flutterflow? Which ones are you kind of seeing are the most popular ones that you guys are linking up with?
To be honest, and you would think that like one would win by a landslide, but that's not the case. It's really distributed, because what I've like come to learn, which was like non-obvious for me, is that like the way that a software vendor like a Bubble or a Webflow puts together their tool, like it's almost like an expression of who they are, and different people gravitate towards that expression. So, some people will prefer to build, for example, in WeWeb. Some people will prefer to build in Bubble. We see Webflow. We see so many different front ends that people leverage. Now, in terms of capability, there are others that stand out in terms of capability more than others, but for the most part, if you look at kind of all the front ends they connect to Xano, it's all over the place.
You've been in the no-code space for a few years now. A couple of the listeners would be familiar that we've had a couple of people in the no-code space in the past as well. What are you seeing for the future of no-code and the future of Xano? Where do you kind of see that playing out into the future?
So I think the future of no-code is that right now we're still in a place where I would say no-code, the term has a lot of baggage, right? Like there are people that still don't take it seriously in terms of what it can do, and rightfully so. I think it's earned that because the tools were really built to solve an immediate need, not thinking about things on the long term. I think the next generation of no-code tooling, and even in some respects, the existing no-code incumbents are like upping their game. They're trying to build to basically be able to create software for anyone, any situation, any circumstance. And so the future of no-code I see as this is the mechanism in which people build software. It's called no-code today, but I think like, why would you want to hand roll things when you could just write it in like a tool that you can visualize what is happening? So I believe that over the next 3 to 5 years, like you're going to see more and more of that. You already see this right now. And I think in Xano's role, like our mission is to empower anyone to create scalable world-class software. And the 3 dimensions that we think about are scalability, their security and compliance, and reliability. So if we can be the master of those 3 things and really make that accessible to anyone that's building software, I think we will be happy with the role that we play in enabling the next generation of software creators.
Okay, that's really cool. Do you guys ever plan to go into doing a front end as well, or are you purely focused just on the back end and becoming the experts and the leading player in that?
Yeah, I know they say never, but like we've basically said we never want to touch the front end. It's too hard. It's like we believe that there is more than enough work to do a very solid, robust back end. And once you get into the front end game, you're fighting a battle on multiple fronts, right? You have to think about responsiveness. You've got to think about, native mobile. You got to think about, all of the dynamics that it goes to make like a really rich front end application. And to do that really well and to do the back end really well it's tough.
I guess now you've been doing Xano for 6-7 years roughly. As you're kind of looking back on that journey, what have been some of the special moments along the way?
I feel like there's all these special moments as you're validating especially coming from like a failed startup, right? Where I was the founder and it just wasn't working. And you try so hard to make something work, but ultimately the market dictates kind of whether your product should exist or not. And I think the moment where we had like this early access and then we flipped on a switch to where we're like, hey, look, if you want to pay for the product, here's a credit card link, and then you can continue. We gave them the ability to have it for a year for like this deeply discounted price. Getting in, obviously, those first payments is incredible because it's validation, right? Like, oh my God, someone wants to pay for it. And that's like a moment of joy, like where someone out there who is a stranger wants to give you money for the thing that you made. And like, you just can only hope. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to build a big business out of that, but that's like a moment of delight right there. And then when you see them telling their friends or like getting really upset if your tool isn't working the way they think because they rely on you so heavily, there's like the first pieces of feedback I get that's a moment of joy. And then just to kind of bring it full circle, just a week ago, I saw someone post in the forum, that was one of the people that first paid us money when we launched. They're still around. They're still using the product, which is crazy to me, right? Like we're so much bigger and everything like that, but they're still using it. So that, I mean, you just have these moments where, because you're basically creating a baby, you know, you're trying to like get it to walk, or to crawl, to walk, to run, all those things. And when it starts happening, like, it's great. And we're just getting started still. Like it's still like we have so much more to go, but like just to celebrate those little victories, I think is important.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. That would have been a very special moment, being able to see that someone from the very beginning is there right now, 7 years later. That's very special. Yeah, I'd love to move into, I guess, some broader life questions, because I know you've had experience across a variety of different things, podcasting. You're at Google, you've did a startup, now you're running quite a big company. As you kind of reflect back on that journey and your life, what are some of the life lessons that you've learned, or what would be life lessons you would go back and tell your 20-year-old self?
Well, there's definitely the things that matter take time, one. And I think that's just like really a theme of being patient, right? Like if you really want something, you got to put in the work, and that work is going to probably take longer than you think. It almost always will. So I definitely want to make sure that certainly is something I think I would have like drilled into myself a little bit more when I was younger. I think the second thing is really always seeking the truth, like the objective truth. They talk about this in terms of intellectual honesty. You've probably heard about this before, where you're being honest with yourself, truly honest with yourself about how things are going. And what I mean by that is, especially when you're starting your first thing, your first company, it's very easy to put on rose-colored glasses and to always focus on the positive when you want to will something to make it work. And that's a really strong character trait to have. But I always say you should have your head in the clouds, but your feet on the ground. You have to have a sense of reality and what's happening. Like for me, for example, for Xavinant, I wasn't being objective enough to see how like the numbers of the business were flowing and if it could be a sustainable business. I was just focusing on like, hey, like where am I going to get that next customer? Like if only these things were true, and it never manifested. And I think that when you don't do that, that just comes with a lot of pain later. And so that seeking the truth and intellectual honesty, seeking it from other people that you know will be honest with you, I think is very important. The final thing that I'll say, and this is a little counter to what I just said, is that understanding the truth of like the feet on the ground piece, but if you have conviction around something you want to pursue, and people are telling you their truth, like, hey, this is not a good idea, sometimes you have to filter that out, and you have to make the decision ultimately at the end of the day around what's right for you. And I think there's a difference in terms of like being truthful with yourself, the business, objectively true about where things are and where you can change them, and then the direction that you're heading in life. And you have to be true to yourself in terms of what gives you joy and what gives you energy. So things that matter take time, seeking the truth, and really being yourself despite what other people tell you that you should be.
Wow. There's some awesome lessons. I'm going to be writing them down in a journal today, I think. That is amazing. This is another question I'd love to ask you before we move on to the rapid finishes. But I heard on another podcast, because you also run a podcast yourself and host a podcast. You said running a podcast helped you to ask better questions. I'm just curious, what are some of the ways you've learned to ask better questions, or what are some tips you've learned on asking better questions? This is something that I'm trying to get a lot better at, and I'm just curious, what have you learned in that area?
Yeah, so just for context for the audience, I am part of this company called Doctor Podcasting. They basically are the podcasting arm for like hospital systems around America. So they'll go to the hospital and say, you're busy saving lives. You probably don't know how to stand up a podcast, schedule, pick the topics. We will do that for you. So I was one of like four hosts. Like, this was like maybe 8 years ago, and now they're up to like 50 or 60 hosts, like hundreds of hospital systems around the world. And I unfortunately, I would love to do more, but since I'm so busy with Xano, I do like one a month now, where I used to do a lot more. So that's the background. I think that with regards to asking better questions, really what it comes down to is like trying to like identify, we talked about like finding your superpower or your truth, right? It's really trying to kind of find what that is in someone else. And when you kind of can like tap into their essence, you're able to act like every person, I don't care who it is, brings a very unique perspective. And you should not write off anyone, because what you can learn from each individual is incredible if you take the time to listen. And I think asking the question and then doing more listening than talking actually will make you a better operator in life, in work, in your relationships. And so really trying to tap into their essence, what drives them, what motivates them, helps you reorient and craft like the way you think about things just from another perspective. And that's what it is at the end of the day. We're all trying to figure out this thing called life, and then having different perspectives to help form your own opinion, to help inform the things that you believe and don't believe, I think are very important. So the podcasting is a great mechanism to do that. I mean, Josh, I'm sure you've had there's a lot of wisdom that you've gained in having these conversations, trying to find someone's truth at this age, right? That's such a formidable age of like 20 to 30, where we're trying to figure things out, and then like really narrowing in the conversation so you can get that out of someone is important. Like you could have taken this conversation and only focused on like, why did you pick these features in Xano? And we could have had a conversation about that, but you chose to kind of orient it towards like, like philosophical things, like things that maybe lessons that may really benefit your user base. And that comes from understanding, right? And trying to kind of stand up what is your truth in terms of putting this Map of Mentors podcast together. So I think that's really what it comes down to, like finding the person's essence and then trying to kind of shape and shift it towards what you're trying to do in your life.
Well, I'd love to move on to the final segment. It's called the rapid fire finishes. It's just 5 rapid fire questions for a bit of fun to finish up. So the first question is, what is your favorite book?
The truth is I don't really read much. I listen to a lot of podcasts. That's the honest truth. But I would say like probably Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink. That's a good one. Atomic Habits, I know everyone has heard of, but the Extreme Ownership piece is just because like you kind of have you heard of this Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink? Yeah. So it's really about, if you take responsibility for things, your life gets easier, actually. And you can like kind of shape and inform what you can do about the scenarios and situations that come up in your life. So I would say I gleaned a lot from that book.
And then the next one is, what is your favorite movie?
I thought, for whatever reason, I have always, and this is going to sound cheesy, but I've always liked The Matrix. I remember seeing that movie the first time it came out. I left the theater and I walked back in, and I did that like twice, right? And I think that there's something like at its time, it was the first movie that kind of questioned like, is this reality? Is there something more, right? And accessing that something more is this concept of like believing, right? You have to believe in a certain way that you're capable of more and doing more in order to get there. And like, it wasn't clear to me at the time, like obviously there's all these special effects and like bullet time and all that stuff, but if you look at the essence of that story, that's really what it's about. And it was the first kind of movie that like begged that question in a really cool way. And I think that's why I continue to gravitate towards that as an answer.
That's awesome. Yeah, it was such a good movie when it came out. Just especially the special effects, and there's that scene of the bullet going slow-mo past now. Yeah, it's great. If you could have dinner with any 3 people, they can be dead or alive, and from any time in history, who would you choose to have dinner with?
This is a tough one, but I would like you generally categorize your life into mind, body, spirit, right? So for the mind part, I really respect Chamath Palihapitiya. I don't know if you've heard of him before. He used to be at Facebook. He's like a big investor. He's on the All In podcast right now. He's also a fellow Sri Lankan like myself. I think that he has a very similar life philosophy that I do. Has this growth. He's like a learner. He's a voracious reader, exquisite vocabulary. It's like everything is like pretty amazing. So just like being able to pick his brain on the mind side. On the body side, I would say Coach Christopher Summers. He is the owner of like Gymnastic Bodies. He has coached many Olympians on mobility, flexibility, and longevity through movement. I think as I get older, I have young kids as well. Like movement and that endurance in movement is very, very important. And I think talking to someone who focuses so much on body weight and like, movement restriction and opening that up would be really interesting. And then finally, Paramahansa Yogananda on the spirit side, who is like a Western guru. He's no longer alive, but just his philosophy around life, around how work integrates with like your spiritual self. And even if you're not spiritual, I think it's a really interesting read. So those would be the three.
That's awesome. A good balance of a couple of different areas. I like that. And then the second last one is, if you could go back to any one day in your life just to experience that day exactly as it happened, what day would you go back to?
I'm gonna give an answer that's like like this was 2 weeks ago actually. We kind of had this like cold bout where I live, and it hasn't really been sunny lately. It isn't right now, but it hadn't been. And there was a weekend where, obviously as a CEO, it's like extremely busy. I'm like always working, traveling, whatever. But it was the first time where I was able to kind of like sit still. Like I sat outside with the kids. I've got 2 kids in the sun. My wife brought us like a little picnic, and we just spent the day doing nothing, like just outside, just in our backyard. And it was like so ideal. Like it gave us a moment to just like appreciate, like stand still and to appreciate what we had. And running a company is not easy. You're just always thinking about the next thing, the next fire to put out. But to be able to sit still and enjoy your children, enjoy your family, and to enjoy like everything that you have was something that was very, very nice. And I I've been thinking about that day actually quite a bit since a couple weeks ago. So sure, I could go back to like something in my childhood, but that's like what I've been thinking about recently, just more moments like that. So I would have no problem reliving that day over and over.
That's awesome that it was so close. That means you're in the best part of your life then. If it was only 2 weeks ago, that's awesome. And then the final question is, if you could know the absolute truth to any one thing, what would you want to know the truth to?
I think like there is this like, I think to simplify the answer, it would just be happiness, like lasting happiness. I think like everything that we do, I think is driven towards trying to be, we wouldn't do things if it didn't give us some sense of joy. But I think like it's always temporal. We're always kind of seeking the next thing. So that like true, like unending happiness, like the formula for that seems great.
That's awesome. I really like that. Before you go, is there anywhere that people can go to follow your journey or follow Xano's journey? Where's the best place to do that?
Yeah, I mean, you could check out Xano at xano.com if you're ever interested in building software for yourself. I don't really post on the socials that much, so I would say probably the best thing to do is to follow Xano, and like if you want to know what I'm up to, it's probably going to be listed somewhere there. But yeah, I mean, that's probably the best place. Yeah, so I would say at No-Code Backend on Twitter and Xano.com.
Awesome. I'll put those down in the show links below. But yeah, thanks so much, Prakash, for coming on. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, Joshua, really thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And this was a fun conversation.